Hello everyone, welcome to today's session on gestalt psychology and behaviorism. Gestalt psychology emerged in Austria and Germany in the early 20th century. The proponents of gestalt psychology were Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, Kurt Kofka, and others. According to this perspective, perception can only be understood as a whole, entire event. It also proposes that psychological events such as perceiving and sensing cannot be broken down into smaller elements and still be properly understood. Their motto, "the whole is greater than the sum of its parts," is widely popular. A perceptual experience such as perceiving a melody or a shape is more than the sum of its sensory components. Consider this. A mountain is just a big piece of rock. Water is, well, just water. A patch of grass is nothing more than food for cattle. But when you put it all together, you get a scenery, you get a view. Individual elements, when put together, gets elevated to a higher level of meaningful experience. Have you heard about phi phenomenon? Even if not, you have certainly seen and experienced it. Can you see the lights moving in this clip? But I'm sure you're all aware that the lights are not moving but just blinking. This is due to phi phenomenon, where a series of blinking lights gives us the feel of watching moving light, while in fact the lights stay in the same place and are only turning on and off. This turning on and off of lights placed nearby at an optimum distance, combined with the speed, intensity and brightness of light, creates an apparent motion of lights from one point to another, which is just an illusion. This explains the world as not just how we receive it, but rather of how we perceive it. Gestalt is a German word meaning good form or good figure, interpreted as pattern or configuration in psychology. Thereby, its focus is on studying whole patterns rather than small pieces of them. It focuses on two components: structure and organization. Stimuli were said to have a certain structure, to be organized in a certain way, and that it is to this structural organization rather than to individual sensory elements that the organism responds. When a person is conditioned, he or she doesn't simply respond to the absolute properties of a stimulus, but to its properties relative to its surroundings. A group of dots aligned in a certain way can make you tell that it is a dotted circle or a dotted line, rather than just viewing it as a group of dots. What do you see when you look at this image? We all know a circle by definition is a closed figure, though in this figure this criteria is not met. You perceive it as a circle. You also see a diagonal line and the letter A, though the lines don't meet. Now, let's look at an important contribution of this perspective: Gestalt principles. These principles determine how humans perceive visuals in connection with different objects and environment. Some of the Gestalt principles are proximity, similarity, figure and ground, continuity, closure, and connection. Now we will take a detailed look at each of this principle. First, let's consider proximity. What do you see? The first set of dots is seen as a group of 9 dots due to its proximity, while the rest of the dots seem just random even though they are a group of 9 dots. Let's have a look at similarity now. The law of similarity captures the idea that elements will be grouped perceptually if they are similar to each other. Take a look at this figure. You tend to see a set of red dots and a set of white dots. You see a set of rectangles and a set of triangles. The objects are grouped because of their similarity. The next principle is figure and ground. This phenomenon captures the idea that in perceiving a visual field, some objects take a prominent role, the figures, while others recede into the background, the ground. The visual field is thus divided into these two basic parts. In this image, if you consider black color as a background, what do you see? Now, consider white color as background. What do you see? Did you see different things? When you change the background? This is figure and ground principle. The next principle we'll be looking at is continuity. The law of continuity, also known as the law of good continuation, states that elements of objects tend to be grouped together and therefore integrated into perceptual wholes if they are aligned within an object. For example, take a look at this figure. You can see a square formed by the incomplete circles, though there is no square. And also you see a set of keys. You assume the first key is on top of the second key. This is because of the principle of continuity. Let's look at law of closure now. Law of closure tells us that we perceptually close up or complete objects that are not in fact complete. For instance, what do you see in this image? You can see that the shapes are same, but in the first instance you see the number 13, while in the second instance you read it as B. This is because we tend to complete objects which are not complete if they are perceptually closer. Let's move on to the next principle, connection. The law of unified connectedness states that elements that are connected to each other using colors, lines, frames, or other shapes are perceived as a single unit when compared with other elements that are not linked in the same manner. Look at this image of 9 circles. You tend to perceive it as two groups of 3 circles just because the 3 circles are joined by lines. Even though the circles are of the same size and are placed at an equal distance from each other. Gestalt principles helps us make sense of the world. Moving on to another major perspective of psychology, behaviorism. Behaviorism was termed by Watson. In this perspective, the focus is on scientific inquiry and only observable behavior, that is, behavior which can be seen and measured, is studied. Unlike other perspectives, refuting the claims of unconscious motives, internal mental processes, etc. Behaviorists believed that behavior can be shaped through learning. In fact, John Watson made a claim that he made a statement: give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist that I might select: doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, and yes, even a beggar and a thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. Such was the strong belief of behaviorists that all behaviors are shaped through learning. This perspective employs a systematic approach to understanding the behavior of humans and other animals. According to this theory, behavior is a reflex or a response learned especially through reinforcements and or punishments. Behavior in its basic form is nothing but a stimulus response relationship according to this perspective. According to behaviorism, even phobias are learned through process of conditioning. Phobias are intense irrational fear of non-threatening stimulus. Even this intense fear can be planted in an individual through learning, through conditioning. The best example of it is Little Albert experiment. First, let's take a look at the concept of conditioning. There are two types of conditioning: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Let's take a look at classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov's work on conditioned response was a major development in behaviorism. In his experiments, dogs associated the presentation of food, something that naturally and automatically triggers a salivation response, with the sound of a bell at first, and then the sight of lab assistant's white coat. Eventually, the lab coat alone elicited a salivation response from the dogs. The classical conditioning process works by developing an association between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. Like in this case, where a dog, when presented with food, gives the response of salivation. After conditioning, the dog, when presented with the sound of a bell, starts salivating even in the absence of food. This is because of conditioning. Classical conditioning is a technique frequently used in behavioral training in which a neutral stimulus is paired with a naturally occurring stimulus. Eventually, the neutral stimulus comes to evoke the same response as the naturally occurring stimulus, even without the naturally occurring stimulus presenting itself. Moving on, now let's take a look at operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner conducted his experiments where the organism has to act and operate on its environment in order to receive rewards or to avoid harm. In his experiment, the organism, after a few trials, learned to operate the correct switch in order to receive its reward, the food. Operant conditioning is also known as instrumental conditioning. It's a method of learning that occurs through the use of reinforcements and punishments. In this operant conditioning, an association is made between behavior and a consequence for that behavior. Unlike classical conditioning, in operant conditioning, the organism has to work, operate, act in its environment before receiving something. It cannot be idle. Reinforcements and punishments plays a major role in how the organism learns the expected behavior. Both classical conditioning and operant conditioning as techniques play a major role in behavior modification. Behaviorism is one of the major perspectives of psychology and has influence on field of learning and education. Both behaviorism and gestalt psychology is a major part of cognitive psychology and holds important place in psychotherapy. That's it for the present session. A brief introduction to gestalt psychology and behaviorism. Thanks for watching. See you in the next session. Until then, take care and bye.